Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this bill which will allow for the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, I am absolutely gutted that I did not get an opportunity to vote a little bit earlier on to allow the member for Miku South to continue his contribution. Unfortunately, in our local palace, Kong strike, and so I went downstairs to have my lunch. But Mr. Speaker, every time he speaks, it's of benefit to me. Mr. Speaker, the more he speaks, the more votes I get in the constituency of Grozile, Mr. Speaker. It's simply because I represent an intelligent bunch of people that will read this legislation for themselves and understand that this is not a legislation just for this August chamber or for those before us or those who currently exist. But this legislation is about the young people of this country, Mr. Speaker. It is not just about these individuals that were here earlier on, these young lawyers, but it's about the babies that we walk around and we see being carried by their mothers, Mr. Speaker. And those babies that we've not even seen, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, when you have a country like St. Lucia that is so vulnerable to global shocks, you show your mettle as a leader when you think about the generations to come, Mr. Speaker. You show your mettle when you think about what if something happens, Mr. Speaker. And we saw for almost 6 years a government being run with no evaluation of consequences for how monies were spent in this country. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am not surprised that the leader of the opposition would have a gripe with a minister making any decision for boards. And Mr. Speaker, what was this about all of a sudden, Mr. Speaker? We have ministers and cabinets making decisions on the composition of boards for years in this country, decades in this country. And at every juncture, he took the opportunity to say, appointed by the minister. But you know what this told me, Mr. Speaker? It told me that he knew what he would have done. It is a reflection of what they know they do or they would have done given the opportunity. And so, when I listened to the member for Castries East make the presentation, and then I heard the contribution from the member from Miku South, it is chalk and cheese what we've had for leadership of this country over the last 7 years, Mr. Speaker. It is chalk and cheese. We have an honorable Prime Minister who has full confidence in the people of this country to make decisions in an ethical manner in the best interest of the development of this country. And then we have a pessimist. He will look at every single aspect of what's going on and see it through the light of what they did, Mr. Speaker, in their 6 years, Mr. Speaker. But the fact of the matter is, this St. Lucia Labour Party government is not like them, Mr. Speaker. And they, Mr. Speaker, are not like us, Mr. Speaker. And that is what the people of St. Lucia need to know. They are not like us. And they cannot be like us because we see the bigger picture. We see today, tomorrow, and in the future, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we look at this bill, Mr. Speaker, we've had so many discussions, and I heard a definition for sovereign wealth fund. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, if you go online, you would probably get about 40 different machinations and definitions for a sovereign wealth fund. But, Mr. Speaker, after doing some reading, from my vantage point, to put it simple, a sovereign wealth fund is a mechanism by which a government puts finances aside, Mr. Speaker, for rainy days. for rainy days. In the case of St. Lucia, we know we are extremely vulnerable to global phenomenon such as climate change. That's what it is, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Reuters defined the sovereign wealth fund as an investment vehicle owned by countries, Mr. Speaker. Most act as an investment account or as a development tool or as a combination of the two. They are designed to be a nest egg, allowing current money to be deployed in a way that benefits future generations. Mr. Speaker, of the million of definitions I saw, when I saw this definition, there was an interest here for me, Mr. Speaker, because this money can be used 40 years from now, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we look at the consideration for the future, I always ask myself, sometimes you have to reflect, why am I a member of the St. Lucia Labour Party? Mr. Speaker, it is this St. Lucia Labour Party that has been the party of development of young people. And that is a fact. And in doing this right now, there is a huge consideration for the development of young people and the sustainability of their livelihoods, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a crowning moment for me and for the St. Lucia Labour Party when it comes to youth development. This is the government of the youth economy, Mr. Speaker, and they cannot take that away from us. When the member for Castries East mentioned the youth economy, I remember they chuckled. They laughed, Mr. Speaker. This is a government, Mr. Speaker, of the MSME loan grant, Mr. Speaker, that our young people are benefiting from. This is the government of a semi-professional football league, Mr. Speaker, of an alternative sport, Mr. Speaker. This is the government that removed VAT on sports equipment for young people. And now, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing, Mr. Speaker, that this is a government that is ensuring that something is put aside for the young people of this country, Mr. Speaker. This is the government putting something aside for the next generation. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm buoyed by these developments, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the MP for Grosley, I look forward to what happens in the future, Mr. Speaker. There's always consideration of the future, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we heard so much conversation about whether or not we should be establishing this fund, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as the member for Castries Central indicated, in 2017, this opposition leader started the process of establishing a fund. And we saw the first draft. We were able to read for the first draft, Mr. Speaker, and the member for Castries Central dealt with the differences between the two governments, Mr. Speaker. But, you know, sometimes when you listen to them, you wonder, what were they doing for the 5+ years? What were they doing in government for the 5+ years? And the member for Dennery North always says the investment was in horses, Mr. Speaker. The investments were into Etiwaki, Mr. Speaker. And you compare this, Mr. Speaker, to a government that has done so much for young people in history. We're not even talking about universal secondary education and all the different programs. So much, Mr. Speaker. You wonder why, at the end of the day, they could not establish a sovereign wealth fund. There was so much conversation, Mr. Speaker, about gas tax and other things that will be put aside. And guess what? When COVID hit, Bal fini, vilo asak. But Mr. Speaker, I am proud today to be part of a government that continues to think about young people and will continue to encourage young people to save. Put something aside for rainy days. This is what we are doing here, Mr. Speaker. And so when I heard conversation about we are going into Parliament to fight and to war and to... Like, but what are we telling our people? What in this bill warrants such a reaction? Mr. Speaker, there's no perfect legislation in the world, Mr. Speaker. No perfect legislation. So rather than come and have a discussion, you're letting it be known out there that you're coming to pick a fight. But Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of all my compatriots today. You don't like to hear us say it, but I'm proud of my comrades and my sisters who decided today that they were going to listen to all the machinations, go back to the drawing board and get it even better, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, as a parliamentary rep for Grosley, had this sovereign wealth fund been established years ago, I would have been in a better position. I am going to always remember November 6th, Mr. Speaker, and what happened in the communities of Corinth, what happens in the communities of Marisil, Rivière-Mita, Monchy, and Asukanal, Mr. Speaker. Because as that rain came, Mr. Speaker, the calls came, and persons' houses, Mr. Speaker, were affected, their livelihoods were affected. And had we at that time have a sovereign wealth fund, I would have been able to do so much more for the people of my constituency. But I thank God, Mr. Speaker, that today we are doing the right thing. And parliamentary reps for Grosley who will come after me, perhaps in the next 20 or 30 years, Mr. Speaker, or 35, they will have a sovereign wealth fund, Mr. Speaker, when these circumstances arise, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, as the MP for Grosley and the Minister for Youth Development and Sports, I unwaveringly endorse and support this bill to establish a sovereign wealth fund for St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. And if they don't like it, Mr. Speaker, they can put it in their pipe and smoke it. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.